Okay, well, it's 6:30, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. First of all, I want to welcome all of you to our Cronkite Live session tonight. This is the last one of the semester, and I do encourage you to check out our website. And as we get back after the holidays, we'll be scheduling more of these sessions. So we encourage you to join us. So tonight, our topic is covering Uvalde, managing stress and protecting journalists' mental health. This is a topic that is very timely, and we think it's going to resonate with you all as our audience tonight. Our moderator tonight is Brett Curlin, my colleague. He was my next door neighbor for a while. Our offices were right beside each other. So Brett, welcome. Let me introduce him. So Brett is an award-winning sports journalist and entrepreneur and founding director of the Cronkite News Phoenix Sports Bureau at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. As assistant dean for instruction and partnerships at the Cronkite School, he oversees the Cronkite News bureaus in Phoenix, Washington, D.C., and Los Angeles, California, and the Cronkite Sports bureaus in Phoenix and Los Angeles. He also manages the television production and graphics lab, the public relations lab, the digital audiences lab, and the JET lab, as well as the new media innovation and entrepreneurship lab. Brett is a busy, busy man, as you all can see. Before joining Cronkite in 2014, he was an Emmy Award-winning sports producer and multimedia entrepreneur. His awards include a National Sports Emmy Award, 4 Telly Awards, a W3 Award, a Webby Award, and several Emmy nominations. Brett holds a Bachelor of Science degree from Northwestern University's Medill. Is that right, Brett?
That is correct.
Okay, Medill School of Journalism.
Thank you, Matt.
Integrated Marketing Communications, and MBA from Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management. So Brett, take it away.
Thank you, Malcolm. I have the distinct pleasure of welcoming 4 of our wonderful alums back, and 3 of whom I had the pleasure of working with when they were students. So I'll introduce them quickly. And as just kind of looking around my screen, we have Jamie Landers, who graduated from Cronkite in May of 21, before joining the Dallas Morning News as a breaking news reporter in December of 21. We have Jordan Elder, as an investigative reporter with News 4 and Fox 29 in San Antonio. Prior to that, she spent 2 years reporting in Springfield, Illinois at stations WICS and WRSP. Jordan earned her bachelor's and master's degrees at Cronkite. Matt Roy is also at News 4 and Fox 29 in San Antonio as a general reporter. Matt also got his start in Springfield. Matt played football for College of the Desert in Palm Desert, California. Then got his scholarship to play football at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and then earned his master's degree at the Cronkite School. And Liliana Salgado is a multi-award-winning video journalist born and raised in Phoenix, studied at Cronkite, and Liliana is graduated in 2015, worked for Univision Nevada as a multimedia journalist. A year later, returned to her hometown, bringing her as video journalist for Univision Arizona, and she now works for the global news agency Reuters. So unfortunately, in addition to Cronkite degrees, you all have something else in common, covering the horrific shooting in Uvalde, Texas. And what we're going to do over this next a little bit less than an hour here is talk about what it was like to cover that, your experiences in dealing with that, and to the folks on the stream here, we'll conduct a conversation for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 15 minutes for questions. So as you have questions, please just put them in the chat, and we will circle back to those at the end. So first, on May 24th, 19 children, 2 adults were killed in a shooting at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, about 90 miles west of San Antonio, about 350 miles southwest of Dallas. So Jordan, I know you were one of the, and we were all talking before, and each of you arrived on the scene relatively quickly. Like Jordan, you were one of the first crews, probably about 45 minutes to an hour after the shooter was killed. Matt, you were working from home. You happened to be sick that day. You're working from home, but then you were there every day for the next 3 months. Jamie, you were on the story reporting from Dallas at 3 o'clock that day. Wrote the initial story, and then you were down there a couple days later for 5 days. And then Liana, you happened to be in Texas covering something else. And so you were there just a few hours after the news broke. So I was wondering if each of you could talk about that initial experience, how it unfolded, and what were your initial thoughts in covering the story. And maybe Jordan, if you could start, just because you were among the first journalists there, period.
Sure. So we had actually been working on a different story originally that day about child drownings. And we ended up getting a call from our assignment desk, and they told us there are reports of shots fired around an elementary school in Uvalde. And I had never heard of the city before. I had actually just started at the station a couple weeks before this happened. So we went down there and we started driving, and it's about an 1.5-hour drive. And the whole way there, all of these police cars were flying around us. And we were thinking, oh, I bet there's an accident up ahead. There's no way that they're going the same place that we are. Because at that point, we had no idea what had happened. So we're seeing Border Patrol and DPS, all of these cars going around us, and we're seeing ambulances going in the other direction. And it wasn't really until we pulled up at the school that we realized, oh, this is absolutely where everyone's going. And at the time that we pulled up, they were still taping off the school. It was super active. There was a lot going on, but we immediately knew as soon as we pulled up that this was going to be pretty bad.
And then Liliana, a couple hours later, you arrived. What do you remember?
Like you mentioned, I was in Texas. We were actually I was sent out there to do some abortion stories ahead of Roe v. Wade. And so I had just finished one last interview in Austin when I started receiving alerts from managers up in Washington to start driving the 3 hours to Uvalde. And when I got there a couple hours later, we arrived directly to the meeting point, the center where parents were receiving good or bad news. And so from that moment on, it was just straight working the breaking news story and delivering edits. And we got there again at a crucial moment where parents were finding out if their child had made it or not.
So, and Jamie, what was it like for you reporting this from 350 miles away, and how did you manage that?
Yeah, so for us, this was something that we had kind of been monitoring throughout the day. And, something to keep in mind with this is there are lockdowns and supposed threats at schools all the time. Here in Dallas, we hardly ever go a week without a school on lockdown. We've had days where multiple have within one shift. And so for us, this was something we were keeping an eye on. But I think this was a story that came very slowly and then all at once. It was around that 3 p.m. hour when I started reporting on this that, Greg Abbott had made that announcement initially of 14 kids. And just before that, we had heard from another source that there were 13 injuries and 1 fatality. And so I think the belief from a lot of us was we were hoping and wondering if he had misspoke, and that's where that 14 figure came from. That's how surreal it was, is that you were hoping that he had just accidentally quoted the wrong number. And then, of course, from there, the number just went up and up. And so I got our initial story up after Greg Abbott made that announcement, and just kind of continued to update it throughout the night. And we had a reporter down at the border doing something else who quickly went over because she was the closest person we had. And so through her, I was able to, get some of that color that Jordan and others saw for themselves. But it definitely was very surreal, and it happened so fast from being, a rumor to this just historic moment that would really take over our lives in the weeks and months after that.
So Liliana, you mentioned arriving at the, when the families are finding out, and so often over the years we've seen these scenes where there's the place where they gather the families. And how did each of you as reporters were in those initial days, or Matt, I know you were there for many days after, but how do you approach interviewing those people? These people who are literally finding out whether their child is not school that morning is dead or alive.
I dreaded every second of that. I speaking to the families of people who either their son or daughter survived or their son or daughter didn't make it, was, especially in the days afterwards, was one of the hardest lessons I've had to learn in my time as a journalist. There's the raw emotion. I could never even imagine what that feels like. And so seeing it 21 times and then through everybody who has survived. I mean, I think one of my first interviews was the brother of a young man who caught a stray bullet in the leg, and he just couldn't bring himself to speak for half of our interview. He was just crying. And like, you're in that awkward stage where you don't know if like you should give them a hug. That's all you want to do is just give them a hug and tell them it's going to be okay. But then you're still trying to do your job as a journalist and remain impartial, but you're a human first. So it's still not easy to interview those families, even though we just passed the 6-month mark.
And Jordan, how about you, as someone, like you said, I think you told me, would you arrive about 45 minutes to an hour after they killed the shooter? So how did you handle, like, okay, there's all of this going on, you have to talk to all of these people and the families are coming in and how do you manage that as a reporter?
We went about it human first. And so we left the camera and would walk up to people, and where I was stationed. So we went from the school to the reunification center, which the city of Uvalde is not very big. So that was also their polling center. They had midterm elections that day. So you had to kind of figure out who was there to get their kid, who was there to vote. And a lot of the times, if people did come out crying, a lot of us that were right by the door didn't even approach it. I knew that we had other crews on the way that could meet at people's houses. But if they were just minutes after, like they had just gotten that horrible news just a couple minutes ago, or there were parents who couldn't figure out where their kid was, they were in the hospital, or if they were dead, we left it. And sometimes we would hand people business cards if they wanted to call us. But in that moment, I felt wrong going up and sticking cameras in people's faces.
And how about you, Liliana? You said, again, arriving at that moment as folks are starting to find out. How did you manage that in reporting your story, but also to Jordan's point, like these are people who are just getting the worst news of their lives?
Likewise, we approached a couple people as well, leaving the camera behind and going up to them and asking them. These are people that were just sitting around, and we'd ask them first, what was happening, if they had any news, and if they weren't willing, of course, we walked away, but it was never approaching them with equipment. I do remember a later part of the night, you could hear when someone clearly just got the news, and those were people we did not approach. These are people that threw themselves on their knees on the ground, and just the worst cry you will hear in your life, and there's no way you can approach them. So in those initial stages of the afternoon, when you see people waiting around, we approached them because, we wanted to know, we had just arrived on the scene, so we didn't know what was happening. But later on in the evening, when people were clearly getting the bad news, it was just something not approachable. And the days following as well, we also handed out business cards, and sometimes you do get that person who's willing and they have something to say and they want to put it out to the world. And you also quickly find out who wants nothing to do with cameras at all. So you just quickly step away.
And then how about you, Jamie? I know you said you were reporting it remotely, but then, a couple of days later, you came into town. So how did you manage that?
Yeah, it's really difficult. And I really can't emphasize the media response to this enough. And for a lot of people, this horrific shooting was the first trauma and the media response was the second. For me, of course, it was the largest response I've ever seen to something, but even very well established national reporters who have responded to 20 of these were talking about like they've never seen anything like this before. There were people from just around the globe. There were radio hosts from Ireland and freelancers who weren't even hired by anyone, but were just there to try to sell things to people who couldn't get down there. I mean, I just can't emphasize enough how many reporters there were. And so for me, it was really important to figure out what I could do without talking to people who have already been talked to, 12 times, like utilize the sources who have gotten those interviews and then move on. That was a big thing that we did with our big profile piece in the days following, was instead of trying to get a hold of these families who are already being called by dozens of journalists, like just use what's already out there. And so we aggregated actually all of our profiles, and that worked really well for us. And then, on the ground, of course, I talked to family members who had been outspoken. I kind of had the luxury in the sense of coming a couple days afterward that I could see who was willing to talk and who definitely hadn't, been quoted by anyone. So that was super important. But it was also kind of more about trying to utilize the sensory things and try to portray the pain and whatnot in that way, in describing it, instead of, like I said, just kind of repeatedly talking to these people who have already offered their time. So yeah, it's a hard balance.
So yeah, so Uvalde, it's a town of, according to the Census Bureau, about 15,000 people. I mean, it's a small town. So what was that like as the national media rolls? I mean, you see every time there's one of these events, it's the national media helicopters in, and they're there for a few days, a few weeks, and then they're out. But obviously, the story, and particularly this one, still goes. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. But so what was that like for each of you, of seeing, this media, to your point, Jamie, from all over the world, coming in to cover this, and particularly for Matt and Jordan, like this was, your, part of your larger, your community. So what was that like for you?
It was annoying, mainly because they come in and give the local news like a bad name almost. They're pounding on everyone's doors trying to get the interviews. They're doing their jobs, and that's what their jobs are. However, the people in this small town have never experienced anything like that before. And so once you pound on someone's door and you say, I'm with the media, they just assume everybody's the same way. And so a month later, when Jordan and I and everybody else from the local media are still there, they're like, oh no, we had a bad interaction with somebody from NBC National who was there, and we're an NBC affiliate. So as soon as I say we're with NBC in San Antonio, they're like, oh no, I don't want to talk to you, because they had a bad interaction with somebody there. And that didn't actually happen, because I'm just using NBC National as an example, but it's just annoying sometimes, because it took us probably a good 2 or 3 months to even earn the family's trust in a lot of circumstances, because of the trust being broken by media outlets that just came in and disrupted.
So Liliana, for someone like you who works for a national media outlet, but was, like I said, happened to be in Texas, and I know you cover this, stories in the Southwest, but so what was that like for you as someone from a more national outlet? Like, how did you manage that?
Yeah, Reuters is massive, but I do want to say, I still feel that we're quite different from the national. I mean, ABC, NBC, they all arrive with their massive crews. We all know that. I am still a one-woman band working with Reuters. So I was also, intimidated and bothered by some of their approaches, but I get where you're getting at. We're also a bigger entity. And so.
And by the way, that wasn't a criticism. It was more just curious in terms of your perspective as, not the, Today Show, Good Morning America, whatever, not criticizing them, but, rolling in with their whole crews, but as someone who is coming into a market where, folks might not know your outlet as well as they might Matt and Jordan's or Jamie's, because they're, relatively speaking, down the road.
Oh yeah, to this day, it's hard to explain. What do you mean you're not on the local 5 and 10? It's hard kind of to explain what Reuters is. Even now, I'm still learning it. I'm pretty new. So, it took explaining to these people, we are distributing this story to other news outlets around the world. And we really wanted to highlight, people outside of the US even want to know what just happened in the US. And, I think that's also part of an important step in trying to get that interview, because we get, I guess, this bad reputation of trying to exploit these people, but in reality, we have to show them why this journalism matters and why people around the US or around the globe should know what just happened in Uvalde. So I guess that was my approach as well. And not to mention that these people, one of the reasons why it affected me so much is because I was really seeing a Hispanic community. I don't think I saw a handful of people that were not brown. And so I also wanted to connect with them. That's another way that I tried approaching them, because some of these people didn't even know English. And I think that also helped me approaching them in their own language. And that was one of the ways.
Even further that as well, one, people reached out to Jordan and I from like Ireland and England, like asking if they could use our stories. And two, people still think they're being exploited even 6 months later. I did an impromptu interview with the sheriff who hasn't talked since the shooting, and he was just like, "You guys are just doing this for the clicks. You're just doing this for the ratings. You'll leave as soon as the next thing happens." I'm like, "Dude, there was a shooting 2 days ago. We're still here. Like, I don't know what you're talking about," but that's just what people think.
So one of the things you mentioned about getting people to to open up. How were each of you able to build a connection with the families, and for some of you, 6 months later, still maintain those connections? Matt, you want to start? We were talking about this a little bit before.
Sure. I think it's just constantly showing up. I mean, I was told this when I was a really young kid. People remember those who are there and who show up and who consistently show their face and show the compassion and continuously arrive and put out stories that are true and that are being respectful and things like that. I mean, there's a city council meeting every other Tuesday, and there's a board meeting every other Monday, and you just have to keep going to those things and showing that you're the compassionate person that's trying to get the truth out of this, and not the people who are going against what the family wishes.
And Liliana, because I know you had mentioned about being able to speak to folks in their own language. I know one of the things that came up around the story was some of the language barriers, and some stuff where members of Congress were asking for Spanish language information, and then ultimately I think Texas did release some of the reports in Spanish. But so how is it for you, again, as someone who speaks Spanish, of being able to build those connections, maybe make folks, I talk to students sometimes about, being able to connect with people in their own language, sometimes even no matter how well they might speak the language, your native, no matter how well someone might say speak English, if you talk to them in their native language, sometimes that opens, some doors. What was that like for you?
Yeah, representation definitely matters. I think, just even if you do speak Spanish, and you don't look like them, sometimes that that also matters to them. And so I remember speaking to the grandfather of one of the victims, and I realized he couldn't quite communicate with me in English. He tried, but once I switched over to Spanish, and he realizes I'm this brown woman talking to him and maybe throwing out some slang in there, it's kind of like we suddenly make this connection, and like, okay, yeah, let me talk to you about my granddaughter or my grandson, pulls out a picture. Suddenly, there's this thing that separates you, and it has nothing to do with you as a white journalist. It just has everything to do with how they feel about who they're talking to. And, it's has nothing to do with anything else other than in that moment, it's like, okay, fine, I guess I will talk to you. And yeah, we did experience that, with Reuters, I can do it in either language, but I remember being in Spanish news, and I understand the frustration from the other journalists. There was one press conference when they had promised talking to the Spanish media, and they answered a bunch of questions. And when the Spanish media was ready to ask some questions as well, they didn't want to do it. And so that felt like a disservice to the community who's mainly brown. And it's like, where are they going to get their information?
So we've talked a bit about the process of covering the story as reporters, but you're all human beings. So I want to hit on a couple things here. Like how did you feel covering this story, and what has been the impact on you in covering a story like this? I know, Jamie, do you want to start?
Yeah, that's a loaded question. And, like I said, in those initial days and weeks, it was still so surreal. Like you couldn't really see it for the moment that it was yet. It was just kind of like devastation piling on devastation. Like I'll never forget the moment a couple days after when I covered the story about Joe Garcia dying of a heart attack. Like you couldn't, every time you couldn't imagine it getting worse, it somehow got worse. And that's incredibly hard to digest and break down as a person, because you just feel like you can't catch up. And I think it kind of slowly started to unravel in the weeks and months after that, when you had a little bit more time to sit with everything that had happened. So it was definitely a very long and ongoing process. I think that's something that you don't necessarily hear from a lot of people when they talk about their experiences covering something like this, is how long it lingers. And it's amazing, the outreach that you get from friends and colleagues and people that you've never even met in the business who reach out and say, hey, I've been here, I know what this is like. And that's amazing in those initial moments. But the fact is, it's not just hard in those initial weeks, it's hard for a really long time. And so I think something that I definitely learned from this experience is to be that person who reaches out, because it does make a world of difference down the line when you kind of start to feel like, oh my gosh, why am I still struggling with this? Why is this still so hard? And so just to kind of have those conversations and to keep that dialogue open has been very important, but it's definitely an ongoing process.
And how about you, Jordan?
Something that we talked about in our newsroom, because Texas has seen a lot of shootings like this, is those of us who are newer to the industry, our news director sat us down and said, listen, I don't want you to stuff this away. You need to learn to deal with this, and you need to find coping mechanisms, because sad but true, when this happens again, if you don't process it and deal with it now, it will come back up later, and you will not be able to do your job to the best of your ability if you don't process this. It will keep coming back. So our newsroom put a really big emphasis on mental health and talking about it, going to counseling. We could take mental health days if we needed to, and that was just something kind of under the table that they were like, if you need this, we know that you will be better as a person and a better employee if you work on this and work with it. So they opened that up for us if we needed to do it. And we set boundaries too in what we would talk about as a group, because when you work with a lot of seasoned professionals, it's easier for them to process these things quicker some of the time and talk about it and talk about some of the hard parts. Whereas for us who are still relatively new, it all was very shocking. So we were able to set those boundaries and communicate about, when we're in these big group settings, there are things that we're not going to discuss. We can discuss those in private, just to make sure that everyone collectively is still okay. And I love that we were able to talk so openly about it, because I feel like that helped me process, because for the first few days there wasn't time. Like we were out there, I think the week that it happened on a Tuesday. I pulled probably 65 hours that week. Like we worked a lot. And it wasn't really until the next week that I could kind of sit with it and think about what happened and how horrible it was, and really emotionally go through what I needed to go through to continue.
How about you, Matt?
I felt like I had a slightly different role in this. I'm pretty good at just like burying things and just keeping on trucking on. So for the first month or so, I just they said we need someone to go to Uvalde, I just said yes. And so I just went when other people needed a day off or needed to stay here and maybe take their mind off of things, do a happy story, do something else. I was just like, screw it, I'll go. So eventually, I think I want to say it was like late June, early July. I was like, okay, I'm ready to take one day off. So I took one day off, and I was kind of I went golfing that morning and kind of just relaxed. And then I was on my way to get lunch somewhere. And I remember it distinctly that I couldn't drive anymore. I just pulled over. I pulled over the side of the road and just broke down and kind of just let myself feel everything. And then I was good. After that, I kind of just sat there for 20 minutes and felt everything and kind of thought about the stories that I've been doing and the work. And then I was ready to kind of proceed after that and went on about my day. But it was just like, I felt I had a different role because I needed everyone else to be okay first and then take care of myself after.
And how about you, Liliana, particularly as someone who, one, you've been doing this for longer, but two, if I would imagine you've had to drop, the nature of your role as you come into stories like this.
Yeah, honestly, I think I ended up coming home because my managers were already worried because what happened, and this is my first mass shooting. So going back to what Jordan said, there was no time to process really. So again, I was covering another story in Austin. They tell me, make the 3-hour drive. You're going to Uvalde. As soon as I got there, it was edits, lives, press conference every day of that week until we got to Saturday. So all those days, it's covering pressers, edits, deadlines. And then Saturday came along and the weekend crew in Washington at the desk was like, just go and see what's happening. It was more relaxed. There was no real hard deadline, no presser to rush to. And so Saturday came along and I went to that community garden where they had all the crosses. And I kind of had this like hypersensitivity moment because I was getting B-roll and there was like this gospel music. I was looking at my surroundings and there were people hugging on this side, crying on this side, hugging each other at another point. And I think about it right now and it takes me back because I think at that moment, that Saturday where it was this community event, I was finally processing what I was covering. And I was in front of the crosses and I broke down. And this is the first time this happens to me. And so I took a step back from my camera, realizing like I was not able to continue recording. And I took a couple minutes. I tried getting back to my job and I couldn't get back to it. And so because every focus I had on that camera was something that I didn't want to see. And so I ended up calling my producer and I was like uncontrollable. And I was explaining to him what had just happened to me. I had this moment. And he's like, you know what, I'd be worried if you didn't feel nothing by day. I don't know what day it is now for you. He's like, just, go back to your hotel room, take the day if you need to. We will reevaluate tomorrow. And he gave me the number of the peer support network. So Reuters has the peer support network. It's other journalists who sign up to be your peer support. It's kind of like therapy. So I talked to them that day, told them what happened to me, and I can't remember exactly the psychology term, but they told me you didn't have time to process what you were covering. You were on this rush, this deadlines, and now it hit you, and it's okay for you to feel what you're feeling. You are realizing that all these kids have died and you should take the day. And so that resource I think is really important because I was able to talk to another journalist who had some sort of training in therapy and who understands what we're out there covering. So that's really important to have as well. And if that's not offered to you, obviously any other journalist or friend that you can call when you're on these stories, and they can hear you out.
So, it sounds like, thankfully, all of you had some level of support, and also had at some point had a moment that, understandably, this overwhelmed you. How do you then go, okay, now either now I have to go back out there, or at any point might have you considered, you know what, maybe there's something else I should be doing?
I mean, I think it helped Jordan and I a lot that we're work together and stuff. So I mean, I think that having someone that was also going through it and this at the same time helped a lot. I never got to the point where I needed to be like, no, I can't go back there, because I saw that what the work that we were doing was accomplishing. And I figured, I was like, I'm probably just going to be completely indulged in this anyway because of what I have invested, what the time I've invested in it. So 3 months later, I'm still doing it every day. So I figured, why go to a different story if I haven't seen this one all the way through yet? And I probably will continue to do it until every rock is turned over.
I don't know if it was,
Go ahead, Jordan, sorry.
Sorry, I don't know if it was like this for anyone else, but like in the days and weeks that followed, it felt like any other story was unimportant when all of that was still going on. So even if I told myself, you know what, I'm going to do something else, I'm going to stay in San Antonio for a day and just do a regular story here. When I was doing it, then I was thinking to myself, like, I felt guilty, and I felt like I should be back in Uvalde and doing more there. And that took a little bit for me to get over as well, feeling that guilt of I should keep going, when it's just hard to walk that line of knowing when you need to step back and when you need to keep pushing. And that's something that I'm still figuring that out every day, I feel like.
I would echo that. That's exactly what I was going to say too. It was actually the opposite for me, in the sense that it was really hard to move on to other topics. It's not necessarily that, I wasn't going to get back to it in any sense, but just doing anything else just felt so inconsequential, which is, of course, those other stories are really important, and that, but this is just such a massive story, and you develop this sense of responsibility. Even though there are so many reporters covering it. And of course I knew that, but I still felt this responsibility of like, I see it, so you don't have to. And it doesn't mean anything if I don't convey it properly. And so I felt that sense of responsibility. But I will say what did change for me was I did have to set some boundaries down the road, in the sense of, we were so lucky that these parents had kind of shifted along the way into seeing this not just as the aftermath of a tragedy, but as a movement. And the problem with that for me, though, was, when you're following these people on Twitter and Instagram and TikTok and all of that, there is no turning it off. Like 24 hours a day, I would be thinking about this and only this, and writing about this and only this, and talking about only this. And that is just not sustainable. And I was just totally running myself into the ground for no reason. You can still tell the story without burying yourself in it like that. So I will say that was something that shifted for me along the way.
And Liana, how about you? You talked about that moment, where you were like, I can't do this. How did you then get yourself to go back to the story, or did you go back to the story?
Yeah, I guess I'm in a different situation because, I ended up there because our Texas VJ was in the process of being hired. So when I came back to Arizona, he was hired shortly after. And so he took over the story. But that one day that I did have a breakdown, I talked to a peer support, and I did end up coming back in the evening. I felt better. She had taught me some exercises that I could do on the ground, and just talking to her made the difference. And so that's what I learned as well. Take a step back, realize where you are, what you're covering. We went through some grounding exercises, and I ended up going back to the story. My bosses did want me to leave that next day, though. It was time for a rotation because that's also part of something that they consider important. They didn't want to keep me there much longer. And so I followed the story when I was back in Phoenix from afar doing other work, but I was no longer on the ground. So
how do you all manage, informing the public, the telling the public what they, need to know, and, the emotions of the story in terms of like respect for the families, something, how do you, because sometimes there's I don't know if trade-off's the right word, but there's a balance you need to strike there.
I think with any information that you have, if you feel it's going to have that big of an impact, you need to ask them, or at least let them know that it's coming, because these guys have been blindsided and lied to and taken advantage of by state agencies, the ones that they elected, the ones that they thought were going to protect them and didn't. And now they've been lied to hundreds of times by tens of people that they elected into their positions. So releasing things without them knowing it, or at least giving them a heads up that it's coming, is just, yeah, I could never.
Well, and to that end, Matt, I'm going to share my screen here. And I'm intentionally not going to show this video. But I'm going to tell the story behind it. Is in July, the Austin American Statesman, along with KVU and Austin, released a video that showed what was going on inside around the school at the time of the shooting. It was the first time the public had, and some of you, I imagine many of you have seen clips of this over the last several months. It was the first time the public saw what was going on inside, and this is a story that, as all of you who covered all too well know, that has continued to somehow continue to get worse. And it's the video. I caution anyone before you would watch it. It is horrific. The one that's on this page here, it's about 4.5 minutes. There's 77 minutes of total. Shows the gunman entering the school, how he shows me in the classroom, the 77-minute delay of the police not going in. So that video was released on Tuesday, July 12th. So earlier that morning, there was this, that they were going to, the Texas House Committee that was investigating this was going to meet at 2 o'clock that following Sunday, show the video to the families first, and then release it. And the Statesman and KVU were criticized for not waiting for this to happen, not waiting for the families to see it.
We're also criticized for releasing it with sound. The KVU and Statesman one released it with the shots being fired, with all of the shots being fired, but decided to omit the kids screaming.
Right.
And while the Texas House Committee was going to omit all sound, it's just going to be the video visual.
Yeah. So to this point, I mean, horrific for the families, like you said, no heads up. So this is a one of those case studies in journalism ethics. As journalists embedded in the story, like, what do you think was the right choice? Well, the Statesman, they had, like, KVU, like, broke in live like Tuesday, the moment they had it. What do you think was the right thing? Release a video on Tuesday, or wait until after the families got to see it, and why?
I will say that this was a very difficult day, and I remember actually texting Jordan that night about just how gut-wrenching this was, because as you mentioned already, these parents had been blindsided so many times in so many other ways. And here was one agency that was making the agreement with them first, and they had laid it all out on the table. And for once, these parents knew what to expect. And to take that opportunity away from them days in advance, it's not like the House Committee was going to release this video 2 months after they got their hands on it. I mean, we were days away from this agreement playing out the way that it was supposed to. And so I will say, for me, that just watching them and their reactions was just heartbreaking. And I don't think that there was any reason. A difference of 48 hours isn't much of a difference at all. And I remember texting another person a couple days after and saying, you know, here we are as journalists, like I had to watch the full 77-minute video and write about it. And I had to do that not only, you know, taking in this horrible graphic video, but I had to do it knowing that I was going against the families in publishing this story and writing about this video that wasn't supposed to be there. So I'll say from my standpoint, it was a very difficult day, and I don't think that it was handled properly.
It's difficult too, since we are the San Antonio outlet, like when they turn on their TVs at night, it's us that they watch. So we had to be very, very cognizant of what we did, knowing that's what they would see. They're not going to get the signal from Austin. So for us, it was very stressful. And there were a lot of conversations that happened about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. And we also had to deal with the aftermath. We're there all the time. So the frustration with those outlets and the outlets choosing to show it that way, we ended up feeling that. And I don't want to say that like we welcomed that, but like we obviously wanted to hear everyone out because it was a horrible thing that happened to them. And I'm sure that did increase their distrust in the media more than it already was set in their minds. So it was extremely difficult. And I didn't watch it for a few days. And I felt so guilty about that too, thinking like, oh, do I need to watch this to tell this story correctly? And so that was stressful too, trying to figure out, can I as a human being handle this? And do I as a journalist need to? And that balance is always so hard too.
I definitely think also they could have waited, especially if, you know, it was just days away. I was already gone from Uvalde and I decided not to watch it. And to this day, I have not. I don't know if that makes me a bad journalist, but I just couldn't watch it, and I still haven't to this day. So I can only imagine if I'm an outsider from the story deciding to not watch it, what it must feel like for someone who lost someone in those hallways, in those classrooms, and hearing that, seeing that, when it didn't need to go out there as soon as it did. Leaves you thinking, you know, and to some extent you realize, well, this is why they don't like us sometimes.
Putting it, I'll summarize my thoughts because I have a lot of thoughts on this one, but the families think that Tony Ploetsky, the guy who released the Statesman, who works for the Statesman and KVU and released that, is the devil. Like they hate him, they hate his guts because they begged him not to release this when he did. And he did anyway because he wanted to be first and he thought it was journalistically appropriate, but in my opinion it's not. I mean, like you said, it's a journalism case study of what to do and what not to do in the situation, but with all the context that we have, I covered every single meeting that the House committee had, and they were going to release the information. They were completely respectful of the families and talking to everybody and trying to get a report. They were also going to release the 84-page report that Sunday as well, that outlined exactly what they think, and that's the most detailed account of what happened on that day to this point. They were going to release everything, but this one outlet decided not to let them do that, and it could not have been more wrong, in my opinion.
So you mentioned that report, and also to the folks watching, if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And we'll gather them in our remaining 10 minutes here. A couple more is, as we mentioned, the stories continue to get worse. That report you mentioned, Matt, that came out on July 17th, found the quote was systemic failures and egregious poor decision making allowed the shooting to unfold the way it did. It came out 2 weeks after a report that had been commissioned by Texas Department of Public Safety that detailed 3 missed opportunities by police intervene. So how did it feel as a reporter to learn these things and have to report on it? Like, oh, I thought this story is as bad as it can be. Oh my gosh, now it's even worse.
Well, there was the hard part about that was that there was a report from Alert, which is the active shooting training, essentially, because it's in San Marcos, it's right up the road, that said that there was an opportunity to shoot shoot the shooter before he got in, but it turns out that that was completely untrue. And it was a gym teacher that was in the crosshairs, and he didn't get approval from shooting this person because it was a gym teacher or a coach, and it wasn't the actual shooter. And that was in the alert report, but it was completely refuted in the other report. So it's wading through all of the misinformation and having to make sure. It's like the old journalism adage that we learned from Cronkite is you have to check with your sources. You have to check, get 3 to confirm. With this, it was that times 10, because every single person had an agenda and every single person was trying to find out what happened and put out their version of events. And so the report that came out from the House committee was vetted, was accurate from what we understand, and is their detailed version of the events, because they spoke to pretty much everybody that they needed to speak to.
So I gotta ask, so how are you all doing now?
I feel like it's very up and down. There are days where it almost feels like I am fully through it and fully processed. And then either new information will come out that makes things worse, because that keeps happening, or just something little. Like for a while, like a couple months after, it was really hard for me to be around children, because I would get so anxious and so nervous for them. And like my sister is in high school, and it was so hard for me to think about her being at school or about my parents teaching. That was really hard. And there are little moments where I realized that I'm still not completely through it, but that's why I feel like it's so important to have a newsroom that's open about mental health and willing to support you in that, because I know at any point I could walk up to anyone in our newsroom and say, listen, I'm really struggling with this. Can we talk for a second? And that's something I would encourage students as you're thinking about your first job. Make sure that whatever it is you want to do, wherever you want to go, that's something that you think about when or if you have to deal with a tragedy. Are they going to support you in that way?
For me, since I was already in Arizona, and I guess it got easier, you know, I'm not in Texas covering follow-ups every other day, every couple of weeks or months. But what I do know happened just recently, months later, when we were planning for elections coverage, you know, my bosses kept talking about do a story on the more pressing issues, abortion, inflation. And I remember this moment when I kind of had like a rant, and I was like, wait, is gun control out of everything now? And then we kind of had this conversation, you know, well, that's what everyone's talking about though, and you don't really hear anyone talk about gun control. Now that you mentioned how we're doing, I do go back to that day when we were doing planning for the election story, and they were talking about talking to voters about what they cared about the most, and we did have that conversation. I was like, a couple of months ago, I was on the ground in Uvalde, and it seems like no one's talking about this. And you know, we had that conversation about, you know, well, we will revisit that. But I guess that's one way of showing how clearly I was still attached to the story. And they were like, yeah, but abortion and inflation is what everyone's talking about right now. And so had to move on to those other topics. And that's when I realized clearly it stuck to me, and I was still thinking back to what had happened to those kids, but there were other stories that had to be done.
Yeah, I would echo Jordan in the sense that there are a lot of ups and downs, and it's, like I said before, an ongoing process. And something that we talked about before this panel is like how many mass shootings there have been since, and sometimes the repetition of how these stories play out, I really struggle with. It's very overwhelming to feel like you're living it all over again, even though it's not the same people or the same place and the same circumstances, but some of it is incredibly similar. And I do find myself getting incredibly overwhelmed and anxious about that sometimes as those stories play out. But I'll say too, you know, the unfortunate reality is that it's not like you're just living with this story. There are things that have happened since in our respective communities that have been really hard. I mean, we all covered for the most part the 53 migrants that were found in a tractor trailer in San Antonio. There have been multiple shootings here since this, and there was a plane crash 2 weeks ago. Like, you're never going to have the luxury of sorting through one thing. So I think that's really hard too, is those moments where you feel like things start to kind of pile up again after it's been a little too quiet.
For me, it's just the story never ends. So I think I'm okay, but like just the other day, there was it was a committee hearing. A U.S. representative went down there to learn what the families needed and what the U.S. government could do, and you had 6 families sitting at a table, all speaking to this woman who just flew in from DC, wanted to know what they need, and none of them could contain themselves, and it's just sitting there watching them do that in the town that's been wrecked 5 months earlier. Is just, I had to excuse myself from the meeting and just go out in the hallway, because it was just watching families talk about their loved ones and crying, and it really just never ends. I hope someday that it will, and we get all the answers, but I don't know at this point if they ever will.
So to your point, last question for me, and then we got a couple from the group. According to data compiled by the Gun Violence Archive, this year could be the second highest year for mass shootings in the U.S. on record. There's been more than 600 through November 22nd. So I guess to that end, whether it's this or frankly other tragic stories like Jamie, you were mentioning about plane crashes, what did you learn from the experience of covering Uvalde that might impact how you would handle a story like this? And kind of like, what's the advice you might give to others who might have to cover a story like this?
I would say I have learned how important it is to talk about it and to reach out to those people who offer their help and their guidance. I wish I would have taken advantage of that more. I could still benefit from it. And I'll say for me, you know, I see a question in the chat about like feeling guilty about talking about it. And it kind of goes along with this in the sense of like, I was so afraid to tell people how much I was struggling with this, because I felt like I was giving them, you know, an invitation to say like, you're too young to do this, or you're too sensitive to do this. And no one's ever said that to me. And so clearly I was afraid of that answer because I feel that way. And I feel that way based off of watching everyone else, you know, who seemed to be handling it so much better than I was, and were just so productive and all of that. And the problem with that is that's exactly how I looked to other people too. I had so many people reaching out to me saying like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're still on this and you're just still cranking out stories, and I wasn't even there and I'm having a hard time. And so what I want you to take away from this is that what someone's life looks like, what their author page looks like, whatever it is on social media, online, from the outside, that is no indication of what things are like for that person when they go home at the end of the day. And I want you to know that however you feel about a story, and it doesn't have to be a mass shooting. There were stories I wrote. There was one I wrote while I was at Cronkite that I struggled with for a long time. Whatever it is, your feelings are valid, and nobody can tell you how to react. That is for you to decide, and there is not a right or a wrong way.
Leon or Matt, anything you all want to add to that?
I'd say, I mean, just likewise, I clearly didn't process my feelings until, again, that Saturday, when it was just, you know, kind of a free day, go and see what you can bring back. But I was obviously struggling from the beginning. Just that night when I got there, when I spent the night at the community center hearing people cry and drop down to their knees, I didn't sleep that night. And I had to get up really early to cover a press conference. So clearly I struggled from the beginning. I was trying to sleep and I could just hear these cries. And so I wish I would have addressed this sooner, talked to someone, because I felt a lot better once I did. And they explained to me what was happening to me. I can't remember again the exact term, but we walked through what I could do different next time when I'm covering these stories, because they will happen again, unfortunately. So I would also just reach out sooner than what I did.
For me, it wasn't really like learning the emotional side of it or how to handle it. It was because I think that part is just like knowing yourself and knowing what you need. But for me, the learning process here was learning how to deal with the people and learning how to be a better journalist to who you need to be a better journalist to. Because I think at the beginning, I tried to keep the families and everybody like at arm's length, kind of like I'm here to do my job and I can't get like attached or emotionally invested. And I think I've given up on that by now because they are just I'm getting to know some of them and telling their stories and whatnot. It's hard not to feel and get invested in them. And I think you're a better journalist when you have some emotional skin in the game at that point.
So we have 2 questions from the group and then we'll wrap up. You guys don't mind going just a couple minutes over here? Because I see the one, I think Jamie addressed the question about, the guilt for feeling how, whether you're feeling guilty for how you might feel. One question here from a student: how difficult is it to hide your emotion and feelings when writing or covering a sensitive story like this? This person who wrote this, so they're from Denton, Texas. The shooting happened days before my graduation, which stirred a ton of stress and anger among all families in my community. And it says, with being close to a story like this, I feel like it would be impossible to cover the story without displaying anger and emotion. So how do you handle that in terms of, or don't you, in terms of, parking your emotions to just, just the facts kind of thing?
Hard. It's really hard to be an unbiased, as unbiased as possible when it comes to things like that, because you see what people are doing and you are trying to get the answers that that are available and are there, and people are trying not to give them to you, and you see people struggling like Brett Cross or Emery Joe Garza's parents, and you just don't want to go back to them. Like I almost feel like I'm responsible for giving them the information that they need because they don't have it, and so it's hard not to become emotional. But it's, like I said before, I think it's something that you need is to have a certain level of emotion when you're telling these stories, because you need some sort of compassion and it makes you a better storyteller that way.
I agree. I don't this rule came from where you can't be emotional in these stories, but it's just not like, it's not possible. And when you're out there reporting on these things and dealing with it, people aren't going to get angry at you if you show some emotion. I almost cried on TV so many times, and it humanizes you to the viewer. Like, I feel like they would raise their eyebrow more if you weren't upset about these things. And our anchors, when we were live, because we were in wall-to-wall coverage for probably 6 hours that day, they would ask us, how are you feeling? How are you doing? And they wanted you to about that on TV and say, oh, I'm not doing very well. And honest about how you were doing, because you're a member of that community too. In our case, like, these are people that welcome us into their homes every night. And I feel like it's almost more abnormal to be okay. So I show emotion, do it.
Yeah. And that doesn't mean it like editorializing like in scripts and stuff and saying like this jerk or, whatever, but showing being an emotional storyteller isn't something to be ashamed of.
The last question, I think we dealt with a lot of this over the course of the hour, but if there's anything you want to add, the student at ASU and interested in the mental health of journalists, and from your perspective, how can the folks who work in a media outlet maintain the mental health after these incidents? Is there anything you wanted to add to the stuff we talked about earlier?
I would say something, so Nicole Carroll, who's the editor-in-chief of USA Today, she recently sent me one of her columns about how many, tragedies we're all covering as journalists nowadays. And Bruce Shapiro, who's the director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, is cited in this piece, as he is in many on this topic. And something he talked about that I think is really important, that we have touched on in different ways, is like keeping the peer support and the collaboration among newsrooms, I think would be the most important. And in this piece, he talks a lot about how fragmented newsrooms where people feel isolated is where you see the journalists who are struggling with PTSD and trauma and, you know, all sorts of things like that the most. But in the newsrooms that really foster collaboration and have, you know, kind of that open door policy that Jordan talked about earlier, is where he says, you know, you see journalists who have built up a lot more resilience. And so I think it's like what she said in terms of when you are finding your first newsrooms, it's so important to make sure that that open door policy is a part of that newsroom that you're entering, because it does make the difference as these stories continue to build up, to feel like you can go up to management or to your colleague and say, you know, I really need to talk about this. So I would say so much of what I've seen in terms of what newsrooms can do going forward is to foster that collaboration before a tragedy happens. Don't wait until after.
So with that, and you, hold on, I'm going to share my screen here as we're getting down to the end here, is you mentioned the, Jamie mentioned the DART Center. So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I recommend bookmarking this page. It's the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma housed at Columbia. And their mission is to basically enable ethical, thorough, and compassionate coverage of trauma, conflict, and tragedy, as well as kind of help news organizations and journalists just understand the impact of trauma coverage on news consumers and on themselves. They actually have a resource page for editors and reporters covering the Uvalde school shooting, and you'll see they, you know, everything from, you know, tips on covering children, things of handling gun violence, that kind of stuff. And there's resource pages for all kinds of different topics and everything. So I encourage folks to check that out. They also actually do some training for dealing in trauma. And also our friends at Pointer have kind of a self-paced online course on journalism and trauma. Because again, I know this is, you know, this isn't easy stuff. And, you know, I mean, it's, you know, I mean, I think it's a credit to, you know, it's a credit to all of you for all the wonderful reporting and work, you know, each of you did. And I just want to say, you know, thank you to Matt and Liana and Jamie and Jordan for joining us and for your wonderful reporting and the reporting you continue to do on this story. You know, and thank you all for sharing. I know, again, this isn't easy to talk about and to really open up. I really appreciate it. So thank you all for joining us, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Brett.
Thanks all. Have a wonderful night, everybody.
Likewise. Thank you.